I never thought I'd be standing on the front porch of Willowbrook Manor, watching my own daughter Elena pack my belongings into garbage bags, while her husband Marcus's mother, Victoria Ashworth, supervised from the living room I had lovingly decorated. The same living room where I'd taught Elena to read. The same house where I'd nursed my late husband Richard through his final illness. The same home I'd signed over to Elena and Marcus just 2 years ago, believing I was securing my daughter's future and ensuring I'd always have a place in her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what Elena and the Ashworth family didn't know was that the deed to Willowbrook Manor contained a clause that would change everything. A clause I'd forgotten about until this very moment, standing here in the October rain, feeling more betrayed than I'd ever felt in my 67 years of life. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If this story resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I have something truly special planned for you. Your support means everything to me as I share these life-changing moments with you. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be, Elena said, not meeting my eyes as she stuffed my photo albums into a torn, hefty bag. Her voice carried that same tone she'd used as a teenager when she was caught doing something she knew was wrong, but wasn't quite ready to admit it. I watched in stunned silence as Victoria Ashworth emerged from my kitchen, carrying the antique tea set that had belonged to my grandmother. Elena, dear, I think these will look lovely in the guest room at Pinehurst Estate, she announced. Her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around the delicate porcelain that had been in my family for 4 generations. Those aren't yours to take, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's cold blue eyes fixed on me with the same disdain she'd shown since the day Marcus introduced Elena to his family. Well, Margaret, technically everything in this house belongs to Elena now, doesn't it? And what belongs to Elena belongs to the Ashworth family. That's when Marcus appeared in the doorway, his tall frame blocking my view of the hallway where Richard and I had hung family photos spanning 35 years of marriage. Mrs. Waverly, he said, using my formal name despite the fact that I'd asked him countless times to call me Mom, or at least Margaret. The Sunset Meadows Assisted Living Facility has an opening available tomorrow. My mother has already spoken to the director. It's a very nice place, very appropriate for someone in your situation. My situation? I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. My situation was that I was a healthy, independent woman who had foolishly trusted her daughter and son-in-law when they suggested I transfer ownership for tax purposes after Richard's passing. I don't need assisted living, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I need my daughter to remember who raised her, who sacrificed everything to give her the life she has today. Elena finally looked up, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms. But then Marcus placed his hand on her shoulder, and that flicker died. The Ashworths need the space, Mom, Elena said quietly. Marcus's grandmother Penelope is moving in from Charleston, and she needs the master suite on the first floor because of her mobility issues. You understand, don't you? Family comes first. Family comes first. The words hit me like a physical blow. Wasn't I family? Hadn't I been Elena's family for 28 years before Marcus Ashworth swept into our lives with his old money charm and his mother's suffocating expectations? Besides, Victoria added with a smile that never reached her eyes, Sunset Meadows has activities, bridge games, craft circles, movie nights. You'll be with people your own age instead of being a burden on young people trying to start their lives together. A burden. That's what I had become in the eyes of the Ashworth family. Not Elena's mother who had worked double shifts as a nurse to put her through college. Not the woman who had planned her wedding, helped her through her miscarriage, or stayed up all night when she had pneumonia last winter. I was simply a burden, to be efficiently relocated. As I stood there watching strangers pack away my life, I remembered something Richard used to say during his years as a real estate attorney. Always read the fine print, Maggie. Always know what you're signing. He'd been so meticulous about legal documents, so careful about protecting what we'd built together. And suddenly, like a bolt of lightning cutting through the storm clouds gathering overhead, I remembered. The conversation with Richard's law partner Samuel Morrison 2 years ago when we'd transferred the deed. I remembered Sam's concerns, his insistence on adding protective language. I remembered him saying something about a life estate and residential rights, but I'd been so focused on helping Elena that I hadn't paid attention to the details. Elena, I said, my voice stronger now, before you finish packing my life away, I think we need to have a conversation about the deed to this house. Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment. What about it? Elena owns the house now? We have the paperwork. Yes, I agreed. But do you have all the paperwork? Have you actually read every clause, every condition of that transfer? Victoria stepped forward, clearly annoyed by this interruption to her efficient relocation plan. Mrs. Waverly, I hardly think this is the time for— Actually, I interrupted, feeling something awakening inside me that I hadn't felt since Richard's death. I think this is exactly the time. Because if memory serves me correctly, and it usually does, that deed contains some very specific language about my rights as the former owner. Rights that might surprise all of you. Elena's face went pale. Mom, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your husband's family might be counting their chickens before they've hatched, I said, looking directly at Victoria. And I'm talking about the fact that it might be time for me to make a call to Samuel Morrison and refresh my memory about exactly what I signed 2 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the rain seemed to pause as the three of them exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw doubt in their eyes. Samuel Morrison? Marcus repeated, his voice tight. The attorney? Richard's law partner, I confirmed. The man who drafted the deed transfer. The man who insisted on adding certain protections to ensure that I couldn't be taken advantage of by anyone, including family. Victoria's perfect composure cracked, just slightly. Elena, dear, perhaps we should discuss this inside. No, I said firmly. I think we've done enough discussing behind closed doors. I think it's time for some transparency. Time for everyone to understand exactly what rights I do and don't have regarding Willowbrook Manor. As I pulled out my phone to call Sam, I saw something I hadn't seen in months, uncertainty in the eyes of the Ashworth family. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a spark of hope. Because sometimes when everything seems lost, you discover that you had more power than anyone, including yourself, ever realized. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I used to believe that love and sacrifice were the same thing, that being a good mother meant giving everything of yourself until there was nothing left to give. Standing there in the rain, watching my daughter choose strangers over the woman who had given her life, I couldn't help but remember how different things used to be. Richard and I had purchased Willowbrook Manor 31 years ago, 3 years before Elena was born. It wasn't much to look at then, a rundown Victorian estate on Maple Ridge Drive that had been sitting empty for 2 years. The wraparound porch was sagging, the paint was peeling like sunburned skin, and the interior looked like something out of a haunted house movie. But Richard saw potential where others saw problems, and I saw our future where others saw decay. Maggie, he'd said, taking my hand as we stood in what would become our living room. This place has good bones, strong foundation. With some love and elbow grease, we can make this into something beautiful, something that will last for generations. He was right, of course. Richard was always right about these things. As a real estate attorney, he understood the value of location, structure, and investment. But more than that, he understood dreams. And our dream was to create a home where our future children would feel safe, loved, and cherished. We spent every weekend for 2 years renovating Willowbrook Manor ourselves. Richard would wake up at dawn on Saturdays, coffee in hand, already planning which room we'd tackle next. I'd find him in the kitchen, sketching layout ideas on napkins, his dark hair falling into his eyes the way it did when he was concentrating. Those were some of the happiest mornings of my life, just the two of us, planning our future over breakfast, surrounded by paint samples and home improvement magazines. I painted Elena's nursery a soft lavender with white clouds on the ceiling, because I wanted her to feel like she was sleeping under heaven's protection. Richard installed custom built-in bookshelves because we both believed that a love of reading was one of the greatest gifts we could give our child. He carved her initials into the windowsill of what would become her bedroom, along with a tiny heart and the date we finished the room, October 15th, 1995. "She's going to love this," I whispered to him as we stood in the doorway, admiring our work. My hand was resting on my barely visible bump, and Richard's arm was wrapped around my waist. "She's going to love us," he corrected gently. "The room is just the beginning, Maggie. We're going to fill this house with so much love that our daughter will never doubt how wanted she is." When Elena was born that following spring, Willowbrook Manor transformed from a house into a home. The sound of her laughter echoed through the halls as she learned to walk, holding onto the banister Richard had sanded and stained by hand. The kitchen island became her homework station, where I'd help her with math problems while dinner simmered on the stove. The back porch became our reading nook, where we'd curl up together on summer evenings, working our way through every book in the children's section of the Millbrook Public Library. Richard taught Elena to ride her bike on the circular driveway, running alongside her for hours until she finally found her balance. "I've got you, sweetheart," he'd call out. "Daddy's got you." And when she finally pedaled away on her own, wobbling but determined, he had tears in his eyes. "Did you see that, Maggie? Did you see our girl fly?" Every corner of Willowbrook Manor held memories like that. The dining room where we hosted Elena's birthday parties, complete with homemade cakes shaped like whatever she was obsessed with that year. Horses, princesses, dinosaurs. The family room where she'd build blanket forts during winter storms, while Richard and I pretended we couldn't see her hiding behind the couch. The kitchen where she'd stand on a step stool, helping me knead bread dough, her small hands covered in flour, her face serious with concentration. "Mommy, when I grow up, I want to live here forever," she announced one afternoon when she was 7, her gap-toothed smile bright as sunshine. "I want to have tea parties in the garden and babies in the nursery and maybe a puppy too." "Can we have a puppy, Mommy?" We never got the puppy. Richard was allergic, though he never had the heart to tell Elena directly. Instead, we compromised with Mrs. Whiskers, a tabby cat who adopted us one rainy Tuesday and never left. Elena adored that cat, carrying her around the house like a furry baby, dressing her up in doll clothes, and insisting that Mrs. Whiskers needed her own place setting at dinner. The garden was my sanctuary, the place where I felt most connected to the earth and to my own mother's memory. Every spring, Elena and I would plant new flowers, marigolds, petunias, impatiens, while Richard worked on his prized tomato patch. "Growing things teaches patience," I told Elena as we worked side by side, our hands dirty, our hearts content. "And patience teaches us to appreciate beauty when it finally blooms." Those Saturday morning garden sessions became one of our most cherished traditions. Elena would chatter about school, her friends, her dreams, while we weeded and watered and watched things grow. Some of my favorite photographs of her are from those mornings. Elena at 8, holding up a sunflower taller than she was. Elena at 12, laughing as Mrs. Whiskers tried to catch a butterfly. Elena at 16, rolling her eyes at my insistence that she help with the spring planting, but secretly loving every minute of it. "You know what I love most about our house?" Elena asked me on her 18th birthday. As we sat on the front porch swing Richard had installed for her 16th birthday. She was headed to Millbrook University in the fall, and we were both trying not to think about how quiet the house would be without her. "What's that, sweetheart?" "It feels like a hug," she said simply. "Like every room is wrapping its arms around you and saying, 'Welcome home.' I hope I can give my kids that feeling someday." I squeezed her hand, my heart full to bursting with love and pride. "You will, Elena. You'll be an amazing mother because you know what it feels like to be truly loved." Richard's study was his pride and joy, lined floor to ceiling with law books and case studies, but also with Elena's artwork from kindergarten through high school. He kept every drawing, every report card, every certificate and award. "This is my real legacy," he'd tell colleagues who visited. "Not the cases I've won or the money I've made. This beautiful, brilliant daughter and the home we've built together." When Elena brought Marcus home for the first time during her senior year at university, Richard and I were so excited to meet the young man who had captured our daughter's heart. Marcus was polite, well-dressed, and clearly from a wealthy family. But what impressed us most was how he looked at Elena, like she was the most precious thing in the world. "He seems like a good man," Richard whispered to me as we watched them walk through the garden together, Elena pointing out all her favorite flowers. "He listens when she talks. That's important in a marriage." "He does love her," I agreed, though something in my mother's intuition whispered a warning I couldn't quite name. "And she's so happy with him." We hosted their engagement party in the garden that following spring, stringing lights through the oak trees and setting up tables on the lawn. Elena wore the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our wedding day, and she glowed with happiness as friends and family celebrated their love. It was one of the last completely joyful days we had as a family of 3. 6 months later, Richard's first heart attack changed everything. The stroke came 2 years after that, and suddenly, Willowbrook Manor wasn't just our home anymore. It was Richard's sanctuary, the place where he felt safe and comfortable as his health declined. I transformed the downstairs office into a bedroom so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. I learned to use the medical equipment, to manage his medications, to be his caregiver as well as his wife. Elena was there through it all, helping with doctors, appointments, staying overnight when I needed rest, holding his hand during the worst moments. "We're in this together, Mom," she'd say. Family takes care of family. When Richard passed away peacefully in that downstairs bedroom, surrounded by love and 33 years of memories, I thought Elena and I would grieve together and heal together. I thought Willowbrook Manor would continue to be our sanctuary, the place where Richard's love lived on in every carefully chosen detail. I never imagined that 2 years later, I'd be standing in the rain, watching my daughter pack my life into garbage bags while her husband's family planned their takeover of the home Richard and I had built with our own hands, our own dreams, our own unshakable love. But life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? And sometimes the surprises aren't always pleasant ones. I never should have listened to Marcus when he suggested the deed transfer, but grief has a way of making you vulnerable to suggestions that sound reasonable in the moment. It was 18 months after Richard's funeral, and I was still struggling to navigate the world without my partner of 33 years. The house felt too big, too quiet, and the financial responsibilities seemed overwhelming on my nurse's pension alone. Elena and Marcus had been married for 6 months by then, and they were renting a cramped apartment in downtown Millbrook while saving for their own place. Marcus had just started his position at Ashworth and Associates, his family's investment firm, and Elena was working as a marketing coordinator at a local nonprofit. They were young, in love, and struggling financially, despite Marcus's family connections. "Margaret," Marcus said during one of their Sunday dinners at Willowbrook Manor, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposal that might benefit everyone." He had that earnest expression he wore when discussing business, the same one that reminded me so much of Richard when he was working through a complex legal problem. "What kind of proposal?" I asked, though I was only half listening. I was watching Elena help herself to seconds of my pot roast, the same recipe I'd been making since she was a child. The sight of her enjoying my cooking, just like old times, made my heart warm with contentment. Well, you're carrying a significant tax burden on this property, Marcus continued, pulling out a folder of documents that he'd clearly prepared in advance. Property taxes, inheritance considerations, maintenance costs. It's a lot for one person to handle, especially as you get older. Elena looked up from her plate, suddenly interested. What are you suggesting, Marcus? I'm suggesting that your mother transfer ownership of Willowbrook Manor to you, he said, spreading papers across the dining room table where Elena had once done her homework. It would reduce her tax liability, ensure that the property stays in the family, and give you two a real home instead of that shoebox apartment. I set down my fork, feeling a flutter of unease. Transfer ownership. But this is my home, Marcus. Richard and I built our entire life here. Of course it is, he said quickly, his tone soothing. And it always would be. You'd continue living here, just like always. The only difference would be the paperwork. Elena would be the legal owner, but nothing else would change. Think of it as family planning, smart financial planning. Elena reached across the table and took my hand. Mom, you'd still live here. This would still be your home. But this way, when the time comes, there wouldn't be any complicated inheritance issues. No probate, no taxes eating up the value. The house would already be mine, fair and square. Your father always said that the best time to plan for the future is when you don't think you need to, Marcus added, and I felt a sharp pang at hearing Richard's words used to support this proposal. He was a smart man, Margaret. He'd want you to make smart decisions now. The conversations continued for weeks. Marcus would arrive with new calculations, showing me how much money I could save in taxes, how much simpler everything would be for Elena someday. He brought articles about estate planning, horror stories about families who waited too long and lost everything to government fees and legal complications. The Hendersons down on Oak Street, he said during one of these sessions. They lost 40% of their home's value to estate taxes when Mr. Henderson passed. 40%, Margaret. That's money that should have stayed in the family. Elena was always supportive but never pushy during these discussions. Mom, it's completely up to you, she'd say. But if it makes things easier for you, and if it protects what Dad built, maybe it's worth considering. Victoria Ashworth made her first appearance during this period, sweeping into my home with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. She was impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed, and spoke with the authority of old money and older traditions. Margaret, dear, she said, settling into my living room as if she owned it. Marcus has told me about this wonderful arrangement you're considering. How generous of you to think of Elena's future this way. I should have been offended by her presumption, by the way she spoke as if the decision had already been made. Instead, I found myself nodding along, grateful that someone with more experience was validating what Marcus had been suggesting. Of course, we'd want to make sure everything is done properly, Victoria continued. The Ashworth family has used Morrison and Associates for all our legal work. Samuel Morrison is excellent, very thorough. He'd make sure all the paperwork protects everyone's interests. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was recommending Richard's own law partner, though. At the time, it felt like a comfort rather than a manipulation. Sam Morrison had handled Richard's will, had been a friend to our family for decades. If anyone would protect my interests, it would be Sam. I think that's a wonderful idea, I said. Sam knows our family situation better than anyone. Elena squeezed my hand. Are you sure about this, Mom? Really sure? I looked around the living room where Elena had learned to walk, where Richard had taught her to play chess, where we'd spent countless evenings reading together. If it keeps the house in our family and makes things easier for everyone, then Yes, I'm sure. The appointment with Sam Morrison took place on a Thursday afternoon in early March. The cherry trees were just beginning to bud outside his office windows, and I remember thinking how much Richard would have loved to see another spring. Marcus drove me to the appointment, keeping up a steady stream of conversation about how proud Richard would be of this decision. Sam's office was exactly as I remembered it. Warm wood paneling, leather-bound books, the faint scent of pipe tobacco, that lingered from his father's era. Sam himself looked older than I remembered, grayer around the temples, but his handshake was firm and his smile genuine. "Margaret, my dear, how are you holding up?" he asked, guiding me to a chair across from his desk. "I know this past year and a half has been difficult." "I'm managing," I said. "Richard always said that life is for the living, and I'm trying to honor that." "He was a wise man," Sam said softly, "and he'd be proud of what you're doing today. Taking care of Elena's future this way, it's exactly the kind of forward thinking Richard would have appreciated." Marcus had provided Sam with all the financial documentation, all the reasoning behind the transfer. As Sam explained the process, it sounded so simple, so logical. Elena would own the house, but I would retain all rights to live there for as long as I wanted. The property taxes would be Elena's responsibility, along with maintenance and insurance, but that actually benefited me by reducing my financial burden. "Now, Margaret," Sam said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I want to make sure you understand something important. While this transfer does give Elena legal ownership of the property, I'm including specific language to protect your rights as the former owner." "What kind of language?" I asked, though I was already feeling overwhelmed by the legal terminology and eager to get the paperwork over with. "It's called a life estate," Sam explained. "Essentially, it means that while Elena owns the property, you retain the legal right to live here for the rest of your life. No one, not Elena, not Marcus, not anyone else, can force you to leave without your explicit consent. It's ironclad protection, Margaret. Richard insisted I include similar clauses in all transfers involving family property." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Of course Richard had thought of this. Even in death, he was still protecting me, still making sure I'd never be left vulnerable. "That sounds perfect, Sam. Thank you for thinking of everything." "It's what Richard would have wanted," Sam said, preparing the documents for my signature. "He always said that trust is good, but legal protection is better." Elena cried when I handed her the keys to Willowbrook Manor that evening. "Mom, I promise. Nothing will change. This is still your home. This will always be your home." Marcus shook my hand formally, as if we were concluding a business transaction rather than a family arrangement. "Thank you, Margaret. This is incredibly generous, and I want you to know that Elena and I will take excellent care of the property." For the first few months, nothing did change. Elena and Marcus moved in gradually, bringing their belongings bit by bit, settling into the guest rooms upstairs while I remained in the master suite. We shared meals, shared conversations, shared the comfortable rhythm of family life. But then Victoria began visiting more frequently, and Marcus's grandmother Penelope started talking about moving closer to family. And suddenly, the guest rooms weren't enough space. The house that had felt too big when I was alone suddenly felt too small for the expanding Ashworth family presence. "It's temporary," Elena assured me when I expressed concern about all the changes, "just until we figure out the best arrangement for everyone." But as I stood in the rain 18 months later, watching my life being packed into garbage bags, I realized that some arrangements are more temporary than others, and some promises are easier to make than they are to keep. What I didn't realize yet was that Sam Morrison's protective language might be the key to changing everything. The changes began so subtly that I almost didn't notice them at first. It started with small suggestions, tiny adjustments that seemed reasonable in isolation, but formed a disturbing pattern when viewed together. Victoria Ashworth had a gift for making her intrusions sound like helpful advice, and Marcus had inherited. His mother's talent for presenting personal preferences as logical necessities. "Margaret, dear," Victoria said during one of her increasingly frequent visits, running her perfectly manicured finger along my kitchen windowsill. "Don't you think these curtains are looking a bit dated? They make the whole room feel so heavy." She said the word heavy as if it left a bad taste in her mouth. I looked at the curtains Richard and I had chosen together during our 3rd year in the house. Soft yellow fabric with tiny blue flowers that caught the morning light beautifully. "I've always loved them," I said quietly. Richard picked out that pattern. Of course, Victoria replied with a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. "Sentiment is important, but perhaps it's time to think about what's best for the house now, don't you think? Elena and Marcus are starting their lives together. They need to make their own memories, create their own style." Within a week, Elena approached me with fabric samples. "Mom, what do you think of these?" Marcus and I were thinking of updating the kitchen a little, making it more our style. The samples were all crisp whites and sterile grays, nothing like the warm, welcoming colors that had made our kitchen the heart of our home. "They're very modern," I managed to say. "You don't like them," Elena said, and I could hear the disappointment in her voice. "Mom, I'm not trying to erase Dad's memory or anything. I just want to feel like this is our home too, you know?" How could I argue with that? This was her house now, legally speaking. And wasn't it natural for a young couple to want to put their own stamp on their home? So I nodded and smiled and watched as my cheerful yellow curtains were replaced with stark white blinds that blocked out half the morning light. The living room was next. Victoria had opinions about my furniture arrangements, my choice of throw pillows, even the family photographs that covered the mantel and side tables. "It's just so cluttered," she sighed during one of her inspections. "All these little knickknacks everywhere. It makes the room feel cramped." Those little knickknacks were my life. The ceramic owl Elena had made in 2nd grade pottery class. The crystal vase Richard had bought me for our 10th anniversary. The collection of vintage books I'd inherited from my mother. Each piece had a story, a memory, a connection to the people I loved most. But gradually, they began disappearing. Elena would mention that she was decluttering or creating more open space. Items would be moved to storage or donated or simply vanish without explanation. When I asked about my mother's china cabinet, Elena looked confused for a moment before brightening. "Oh, that old thing. We moved it to the basement. It was blocking the natural light flow in the dining room." The basement. My mother's beautiful mahogany china cabinet, which had held pride of place in our dining room for 25 years, was now relegated to the basement like unwanted storage. Victoria's next target was my daily routines. She had strong opinions about the most efficient times for various household activities, and she shared these opinions with Elena, who then shared them with me as gentle suggestions. "Mom, Victoria mentioned that you like to do laundry on Saturday mornings," Elena said one day, her tone carefully casual. "But that's when Marcus likes to sleep in, and the washing machine is pretty loud. Would it be possible for you to maybe do it on Friday afternoons instead?" Of course it would be possible. I was retired. My schedule was completely flexible. But Saturday morning laundry had been my routine for 30 years. It was one of the small rituals that gave structure to my week, one of the quiet pleasures that Richard and I had shared, him reading the paper at the kitchen table while I sorted clothes, both of us enjoying the comfortable domesticity of the moment. But what harm could it do to change my laundry day? It was a small thing, really. A tiny adjustment to keep peace in the household, except it wasn't just the laundry. It was also the television. Apparently, my evening news programs were too loud for Marcus when he was making business calls from the home office he'd established in what used to be Richard's study. Could I perhaps watch with headphones? Or maybe in the bedroom instead of the family room? Then it was my morning coffee routine. I'd always been an early riser, and I loved the quiet hour before anyone else woke up, when I could sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and watch the birds at the feeder Richard had installed outside the window. But Marcus was a light sleeper, and apparently the sound of the coffee grinder at 6 a.m. was disruptive. Could I perhaps wait until 7? Or use instant coffee in the mornings? Each request seemed reasonable in isolation. Each compromise felt like a small thing I could do to be a considerate housemate. But together, they were slowly erasing my presence from my own home, making me smaller and quieter and less noticeable with each passing week. My friend Dorothy from the hospital where I'd worked for 30 years noticed the change before I did. We met for lunch at Millbrook Cafe every Thursday, a tradition we'd maintained since my retirement. "Margaret, you seem different lately," she said, studying my face across the table. "Quieter. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," I replied automatically. "Just adjusting to having Elena and Marcus in the house. It's wonderful having family close by again." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. She'd known me too long to be fooled by polite deflections. "How exactly are you adjusting? What's changed?" I started to dismiss her concern, but then I found myself describing my new routines: the Friday laundry, the headphone television watching, the delayed morning coffee. As I spoke, I heard my own words as if from a distance, and they painted a picture I didn't like. "Margaret," Dorothy said gently, "that doesn't sound like adjusting. That sounds like accommodating. There's a difference. It's their house now," I said, surprised by how defensive I sounded. "I want to be a good guest." "Guest?" Dorothy's voice sharpened. "Since when are you a guest in your own home?" That phrase haunted me for days. A guest in my own home. Was that what I'd become? When had I stopped being the matriarch of Willowbrook Manor and started being the inconvenient relative who needed to be managed and accommodated? The answer came during my weekly call with my sister Helen in California. I'd been telling her about Elena and Marcus, carefully editing the story to emphasize the positive aspects of our living arrangement. But Helen had always been perceptive, even from 3,000 miles away. "You know what strikes me about everything you're telling me?" she said. "You keep talking about what you can do for them, how you can be more accommodating, how you can take up less space. When's the last time anyone asked what would make you more comfortable?" I couldn't answer because I couldn't remember. When had I stopped being someone whose comfort mattered? When had I become the person who needed to adapt, adjust, and accommodate, while everyone else's needs took priority? The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late September. I was preparing dinner, my famous chicken and dumplings, a recipe that had been Elena's favorite since childhood. I'd spent the afternoon shopping for ingredients, carefully preparing everything just the way she liked it. Victoria arrived just as I was setting the table. She took one look at my meal preparation and wrinkled her nose delicately. "Oh, Margaret, I hope you don't mind, but I've made reservations for Elena and Marcus at that lovely new farm-to-table restaurant downtown. We're celebrating Marcus's promotion at the firm." I stared at her, then at the pot of chicken and dumplings simmering on the stove, then at the table I'd set for 4 people. I didn't know about any celebration. "Well, it was rather last minute," Victoria said breezily. "And I thought it would be nice for the young people to have an elegant dinner out. You understand, don't you? Sometimes couples need their space." Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking beautiful in a dress I'd never seen before. "Mom, I'm sorry about dinner. Victoria surprised us with these reservations and—" "It's fine," I said quickly, because what else could I say? That I'd spent all afternoon cooking? That Tuesday night dinners had been our tradition since she was in high school? That I felt like I was disappearing a little more each day? "I'll put everything in the refrigerator," I continued. "We can have it tomorrow." But as I watched their car pull out of the driveway, leaving me alone with enough food for 4 people and the crushing realization that I was becoming invisible in my own life, I finally understood what Dorothy had been trying to tell me. I wasn't adjusting to living with Elena and Marcus. I was slowly being erased, one small compromise at a time, until there would be nothing left of Margaret Waverley except a polite, quiet woman who took up as little space as possible. And tomorrow, I was going to find out just how much space I was legally entitled to occupy. The final straw came on a crisp October morning when I discovered that my bedroom, the master bedroom that Richard and I had shared for over 3 decades, was being measured for new furniture. I walked in from my morning walk around the neighborhood to find Marcus with a tape measure and Victoria with a notebook, discussing window treatments and furniture placement as if I didn't exist. "The bed will need to go along this wall," Victoria was saying, gesturing toward the space where my own bed currently sat. "Penelope needs easy access to the ensuite bathroom, and the morning light from the east windows will be perfect for her watercolor painting." I stood in the doorway, still holding my light jacket, trying to process what I was hearing. "Excuse me, but what's happening here?" Marcus looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh, Margaret. Good, you're back. We wanted to talk to you about some changes we need to make." "Changes to my bedroom?" Victoria turned to face me with that practiced smile I'd come to dread. "Well, dear, it's not really your bedroom anymore, is it? Technically speaking. And we have some family developments that require us to reconsider the current arrangements." My heart began to pound, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of developments?" "Penelope, Marcus's grandmother, has decided to move here from Charleston," Elena said, appearing in the hallway behind me. Her face was flushed, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Her health isn't what it used to be, and the family thinks it would be best if she lived with us where we can keep an eye on her." "That's wonderful," I said carefully. "Family should take care of each other. But I'm not sure why that means measuring my bedroom." Marcus stepped forward, adopting what I'd learned to recognize as his business voice: professional, reasonable, and utterly inflexible. "Penelope can't manage stairs anymore, Margaret. She needs a ground-floor bedroom with an accessible bathroom. This is the only bedroom on the first floor. So where exactly am I supposed to sleep?" "Well," Victoria said, consulting her notebook, as if reading from a prepared script, "we've looked into several options. There's that lovely guest room upstairs. It's quite charming, really. Or," she paused dramatically, "we've found what we think might be an even better solution." Elena finally looked at me, and I saw guilt written across her face like a confession. "Mom, we've been thinking that maybe it's time to consider a different living arrangement altogether, for everyone's comfort." The words hit me like a physical blow. After months of gradual erosion, they were finally ready to push me out completely. "A different living arrangement?" Marcus pulled out a glossy brochure from his jacket pocket. "We've done some research, and there are some excellent senior living communities in the area. Take a look at Sunset Meadows. It's only 15 minutes away, and they have wonderful amenities. A pool, activities, people your own age." I took the brochure with numb fingers, staring at the stock photos of smiling elderly people playing cards and doing water aerobics. "You want me to move to a nursing home?" "It's not a nursing home," Elena said quickly. "It's independent living. You'd have your own apartment, your own space. No more worrying about household maintenance or yard work or any of that stuff. You could just relax and enjoy yourself." "Enjoy myself?" I repeated, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Elena, this is my home. Our home. The home your father and I built together. The home where I raised you." Victoria stepped closer, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "Margaret, dear, I know change is difficult at our age, but you have to think practically. This house is really too much for someone in your situation to handle, and with Penelope's needs, well, it would be selfish to expect a 90-year-old woman to climb stairs when there's a perfectly good solution available. My situation..." I felt my temper flaring for the first time in months. "What exactly is my situation, Victoria?" "Well, you're alone now," she said gently, as if explaining something to a confused child. "Widowed. Retired. No real responsibilities or obligations. At Sunset Meadows, you'd have social activities, organized outings, medical care available if you need it. It's really the ideal lifestyle for someone at your stage of life. I looked at Elena, desperately hoping to see some sign of the daughter who had once promised me that Willowbrook Manor would always be my home. Instead, I saw a woman who had been thoroughly convinced that displacing her mother was not only reasonable, but actually kind. "Mom," Elena said softly, "I know this is hard to hear, but maybe Victoria's right. Maybe this would be good for you. You've been so isolated here, especially since Dad died. At Sunset Meadows, you'd be around people, you'd have things to do, and we'd visit all the time." "Visit," I repeated flatly. "I'd be a visitor in my own daughter's life." Marcus cleared his throat. "Margaret, I know this feels sudden, but we've been thinking about this for a while. The truth is, this arrangement hasn't been working as well as we'd hoped. You've seemed, well, unhappy, displaced. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you had your own space again." The audacity of his words took my breath away. I'd seemed displaced because they had been systematically displacing me. I'd seemed unhappy because they had been methodically dismantling everything that made me happy. And now they were presenting my displacement and unhappiness as evidence that I needed to be displaced even further. "And what if I don't want to move?" I asked quietly. The three of them exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them, a look of prepared solidarity that told me this conversation had been rehearsed. "Well," Marcus said slowly, "I suppose that's your choice, legally speaking. But it would make things very difficult for everyone, wouldn't it? Penelope really does need this room, and there isn't anywhere else in the house that would work for her. We'd hate to have to tell her that she can't live with her family because of the current arrangements." The threat was politely veiled, but unmistakable. If I refused to move out voluntarily, I would be painted as the selfish, unreasonable old woman who was preventing a 90-year-old from living safely with her family. I would be the villain in their story, the ungrateful mother who couldn't see reason. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Penelope is planning to move at the end of the month," Elena said. "So we'd need to know fairly soon. I've already put your name on the waiting list at Sunset Meadows just in case. They might have an opening as early as next week." They had put me on a waiting list, without asking me, without consulting me. They had already begun the process of removing me from my own life. I excused myself and walked outside to the garden, needing air and space to think. I found myself standing among the roses Richard and I had planted for our 25th anniversary, roses that were now blooming their final flowers of the season. The parallel wasn't lost on me. Like these roses, I was in the autumn of my life, and someone had decided it was time to transplant me. But as I stood there among Richard's roses, I remembered something he used to say when he was working on difficult legal cases. "The law isn't always fair, Maggie, but it's usually precise. When someone's trying to push you around, the first thing you do is find out exactly what rights you actually have." I pulled out my phone and called Sam Morrison's office. "Sam Morrison Law Associates, this is Jennifer speaking." "Jennifer, this is Margaret Waverly. I need to make an appointment with Mr. Morrison as soon as possible. It's about the deed transfer I signed 2 years ago. I need to understand exactly what rights I retained when I transferred ownership of my property to my daughter." "Of course, Mrs. Waverly. Mr. Morrison has been wondering when you might call. He has an opening tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock if that works for you." He'd been wondering when I might call. That phrase stuck with me as I hung up the phone. Sam Morrison, Richard's partner, the man who had drafted the deed transfer, had been wondering when I would call about my rights, which suggested that perhaps I had more rights than Elena, Marcus, and Victoria realized. That night, I lay awake in the bedroom they wanted to take from me, staring at the ceiling where Richard and I had once planned to install a skylight so we could fall asleep looking at the stars. I thought about the life we'd built in this house, the memories embedded in every room, the love that had filled these walls for over 3 decades. And I thought about the woman I'd become over the past months. Diminished, accommodating, apologetic, for taking up space in my own home. That wasn't the woman Richard had fallen in love with. That wasn't the woman who had raised Elena to be strong and independent. That wasn't the woman I wanted to be for whatever years I had left. Tomorrow, I would find out exactly what rights Margaret Waverley still possessed. And then I would decide what to do with them. The morning of my appointment with Sam Morrison dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I prepared to leave Willowbrook Manor. I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I'd worn to Richard's funeral, not because I was being morbid, but because it was the outfit that made me feel most like the strong, capable woman I used to be, the woman I needed to be again. Elena was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, making coffee in the expensive espresso machine Victoria had insisted they needed. She looked up as I entered, taking in my formal attire with surprise. "Mom, you look nice. Do you have an appointment somewhere?" "I'm meeting with Sam Morrison this morning," I said, keeping my voice neutral as I poured myself a cup of coffee from the regular coffee maker I still used. Elena's hand paused halfway to her mouth, the espresso cup suspended in midair. "Sam Morrison? Why?" "I want to review the deed transfer documents," I said simply. "I realized yesterday that I never actually read all the fine print when I signed them. Your father always said that was a mistake people make, trusting without verifying." Something flickered across Elena's face. Was it worry? Guilt? "Mom, is this about yesterday? About the bedroom situation? Because we can work something out. Maybe you could take the guest room for now, and we could convert the basement into a nice suite for you later." The basement. They wanted to move me to the basement like an unwanted piece of furniture. I took a slow sip of my coffee, using the moment to steady my voice. "This isn't about temporary arrangements, Elena. This is about understanding my legal rights in the home your father and I built." Marcus appeared in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep, but his eyes sharp and alert. He'd obviously been listening to our conversation. "Margaret, I hope you're not planning to make things complicated. We've been nothing but accommodating." "Accommodating?" The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "Marcus, I've been accommodating. I've changed my laundry day, my television habits, my morning routine, my evening routine. I've watched my possessions disappear into storage. I've made myself smaller and quieter and less noticeable every single day for months. I think it's time I understood exactly what I'm accommodating myself out of." Marcus's expression hardened. "We've all made sacrifices to make this living arrangement work. It's called compromise." "No," I said, setting down my coffee cup with enough force to make it ring against the saucer. "Compromise is when everyone gives up something. What I've been doing is called capitulation, and I'm done with it." I gathered my purse and car keys, leaving Elena and Marcus staring after me as I walked out of the house. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Victoria's silver Mercedes pulling in, and I wondered if she'd been summoned for emergency damage control. Sam Morrison's office building was exactly as I remembered it, red brick, ivy-covered with the kind of solid, established presence that Richard had always admired in legal practices. The receptionist, Jennifer, was a pleasant woman in her 40s who greeted me with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Waverley, Mr. Morrison is ready for you. Can I get you coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." Sam's office had changed little in the 2 years since I'd last been there. The same leather-bound books lined the walls, the same Persian rug covered the hardwood floor, and the same photograph of Sam with Richard at a bar association dinner sat prominently on his desk. But Sam himself looked older, more tired, and when he stood to greet me, I caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that looked almost like relief. "Margaret, my dear, please sit down. I have to say, I've been hoping you'd call." Jennifer mentioned that when I made the appointment. "Why?" Sam settled into his chair and pulled out a thick file folder. Because I've been watching what's happening at Willowbrook Manor, and I've been concerned. Very concerned. My stomach lurched. You've been watching? What do you mean? Margaret, I've been practicing law in this town for 47 years. I know everyone, and everyone knows me. Word gets around when someone like Victoria Ashworth starts making inquiries about senior living facilities for Margaret Waverly, especially when she's telling people that you're becoming difficult to manage, and that the family is exploring their options. The humiliation burned through me like acid. Victoria had been discussing my private business around town, painting me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. She's been talking about me? To the director at Sunset Meadows. To the property management company that handles several assisted living facilities, even to Dr. Patterson at the medical center about elderly patients who might benefit from more structured environments. Sam's voice carried a note of controlled anger that reminded me powerfully of Richard when he was building a case. She's been laying groundwork, Margaret, creating a narrative. What kind of narrative? The kind that suggests an elderly widow is no longer capable of making her own decisions about where and how to live. The kind that makes it easier for family members to override her wishes for her own good. I felt sick, but I signed the EDI. House over to Elena. Legally, don't they have the right to ask me to leave? Sam leaned forward, his expression intense. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about. Margaret, when you signed those deed transfer documents, I didn't just include standard language. I included very specific protections based on conversations I'd had with Richard over the years. What kind of conversations? Richard was worried about this exact scenario, not specifically about Elena. He loved her dearly and trusted her completely, but he was concerned about outside influences, about people who might try to manipulate family relationships for their own benefit. He'd seen it happen to other families, especially after one spouse passed away. Sam opened the file and pulled out a document I recognized, the deed transfer I'd signed 2 years earlier. But this copy was marked up with highlighter and post-it notes, clearly annotated for our discussion. When you transferred ownership of Willowbrook Manor to Elena, you retained what's called a life estate. Do you remember me explaining that term? Vaguely. You said it meant I could live there for the rest of my life. It means much more than that, Margaret. A life estate gives you legal rights that cannot be terminated by the property owner, even if the property owner is your own daughter. Let me read you the exact language. Sam put on his reading glasses and found the relevant section. The grantor, Margaret Rose Waverly, hereby retains a life estate in the above-described property, including but not limited to the right to occupy, use, and enjoy the premises for the duration of her natural life. Said life estate cannot be terminated, modified, or restricted without the express written consent of the grantor, regardless of the wishes or circumstances of the grantee or any subsequent property owners. I stared at him. What does that mean? In plain English? It means that Elena cannot legally force you to move out of Willowbrook Manor. She cannot restrict your use of any part of the house. She cannot make your living situation so uncomfortable that you feel compelled to leave. And she certainly cannot pressure you into a senior living facility against your will. The relief was so overwhelming that I felt dizzy. But Marcus said, Marcus is not a lawyer, despite working for his family's law firm. And even if he were, he's operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. Elena may own the house, but you own the right to live in it. Those are two separate legal concepts. Sam turned to another page in the file. There's more, Margaret. Richard insisted that I include penalty clauses for any attempt to circumvent your life estate rights. Penalty clauses? If anyone tries to force you out of the property through harassment, manipulation, or coercion, they forfeit all claims to the property. The house would revert to your full ownership. I felt as if the floor had shifted beneath me. You mean if they keep trying to push me out, the house legally becomes yours again, completely and unconditionally. Elena would lose all ownership rights. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All those months of feeling powerless, of making myself smaller, of accepting that I was at the mercy of other people's decisions. And I'd had legal protection all along. Sam, why didn't you remind me of this before now? His expression grew sad. Because you never called, Margaret. And because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. I hoped that Elena would honor the spirit of the arrangement as well as the letter of the law. Richard believed she would. But she hasn't. No, she hasn't. And from what I'm hearing around town, the situation is only going to get worse. Which is why I've been hoping you'd come in. It's time to remind your daughter and her husband's family about the legal realities of your situation. Sam pulled out a legal pad and began writing. I'm going to draft a letter to Elena and Marcus, with copies to Victoria Ashworth and this grandmother who's supposedly moving in. It will be a formal notice of your life estate rights and a warning that any further attempts to pressure you into leaving the property will result in immediate legal action. Will that be enough? Sam looked up from his writing, and for a moment I saw a flash of the fierce legal advocate who had been Richard's partner for over 2 decades. Margaret, I've been doing this for a long time. Bullies. And that's what we're dealing with here, usually back down when they realize their target isn't as powerless as they thought. And if they don't back down, then we'll remind them that Richard Waverley's widow is not someone to be trifled with, and that his law partner takes property rights very seriously indeed. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Strong, protected, ready to fight for what was mine. The drive home from Sam Morrison's office felt different than any drive I'd taken in months. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. My shoulders weren't hunched with tension, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had solid ground beneath my feet. The manila envelope on the passenger seat contained copies of the deed transfer documents, highlighted and annotated to show exactly what rights I possessed. More importantly, it contained Sam's business card with his direct line and a promise that he was only a phone call away. As I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, I could see Victoria's Mercedes still parked in my driveway alongside a black BMW I didn't recognize. The cavalry had been called in, and they were no doubt strategizing about how to handle my rebellion. The thought almost made me smile. I parked on the street, not because I was being accommodating anymore, but because I wanted to maintain my ability to leave quickly if necessary. As I walked up the front path, I could hear raised voices through the living room windows. Someone was upset, and from the tone, it sounded like a family meeting had turned into a family argument. I let myself in through the front door, my front door, I reminded myself, and paused in the foyer to listen. The voices were coming from the living room, and they weren't trying to keep their conversation private. Completely unreasonable, Elena. Your mother is clearly having some sort of crisis. That was Victoria's voice, sharp with irritation. She's not having a crisis, Mother. She's standing up for herself. The unfamiliar male voice was older, authoritative, and clearly unimpressed with Victoria's assessment. Who exactly invited you into this discussion, Preston? Marcus's voice carried a defensive edge I'd never heard before. I invited myself when I heard that my daughter-in-law was trying to manipulate an elderly widow out of her legal rights. So this was Preston Ashworth, Marcus's father, and apparently the voice of reason in the Ashworth family. I stepped into the living room doorway, still wearing my navy suit and carrying my purse and the manila envelope. 4 heads turned toward me, and I had the satisfaction of seeing uncertainty flash across 3 of the faces. Preston Ashworth, however, stood up immediately. Mrs. Waverley, I presume. I'm Preston Ashworth, Marcus's father. I apologize for meeting you under these circumstances. He was a distinguished man in his early 70s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of old money and older manners. More importantly, he looked genuinely embarrassed by the situation he'd walked into. Mr. Ashworth, I replied, with a slight nod. I'm sorry you've been dragged into our family drama. Mother, Elena said, standing up as well. We need to talk. About what you said this morning, about the lawyer. Yes, we do need to talk, I agreed. All of us. Because it seems there's been some confusion about my legal status in this house. Victoria remained seated, her spine rigid with indignation. Margaret, dear, I think you may have misunderstood whatever that lawyer told you. These situations can be quite complex, and sometimes elderly people hear what they want to hear rather than… Victoria. Preston's voice cut through her condescension like a blade. That's enough. I set my purse down and opened the manila envelope, pulling out the highlighted deed documents. Actually, Victoria, I think the confusion has been on your end, and Marcus's, and unfortunately, Elena's as well. I handed Elena the documents. These are the deed transfer papers I signed 2 years ago, the ones that gave you ownership of this house. But they're also the ones that gave me something called a life estate, something I'd forgotten about until this morning. Elena took the papers with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the highlighted sections. As she read, her face grew progressively paler. I don't understand, Marcus said, moving to read over her shoulder. What's a life estate? Preston Ashworth answered before I could. A life estate, son, is a legal right that allows someone to live in a property for the rest of their natural life, regardless of who owns it. It's ironclad protection that can't be terminated by the property owner. But that means… Marcus started, then stopped as the implications hit him. It means, I said clearly, that I cannot be forced to move out of this house. Not to the basement, not to a guest room, and certainly not to Sunset Meadows. This is my home for as long as I live, and no one, not Elena, not you, not your mother, and not your grandmother, has the legal right to change that. Victoria stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You can't seriously expect a 90-year-old woman to climb stairs because of some legal technicality. Mother, Marcus said sharply, please. But I'd had enough of Victoria's manipulations. You know what's ridiculous, Victoria? The fact that you've been going around town telling people I'm difficult to manage and discussing my personal business with strangers. The fact that you put me on a waiting list for assisted living without my knowledge or consent. The fact that you think you can waltz into my home and redecorate it to suit your preferences. Victoria's mouth fell open. She clearly hadn't expected me to know about her behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Preston looked at his wife with genuine disgust. Victoria, please tell me you didn't actually do those things. I was trying to help, Victoria said defensively. Margaret obviously isn't capable of making these decisions on her own. Someone needed to take charge of the situation. The situation, I said, my voice rising for the first time, is that you decided I was inconvenient and tried to manipulate my own daughter into getting rid of me? Well, I have news for you, Victoria. I'm not going anywhere. Elena was still staring at the documents, tears streaming down her face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the life estate. Marcus said what was convenient for his family, I interrupted. But what matters is what the law says, and the law says this is my home. Preston moved closer to Elena, reading the documents over her shoulder. After a moment, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. Mrs. Waverly, your husband was obviously a very smart man. This language is extremely well crafted. You have absolute protection here. Richard always said that trust was good, but legal protection was better, I replied. I just wish I'd remembered that sooner. Marcus had gone very quiet, and when he finally spoke, his voice was strained. So, what happens now? Penelope still needs a place to live, and this is still the only first-floor bedroom. That, I said firmly, is your family's problem to solve. But it will be solved in a way that doesn't involve displacing me from my bedroom or my home. Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Preston held up a hand to silence her. Margaret. May I call you Margaret? You're absolutely right. Owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. What's happened here is unacceptable. He turned to face his family, his expression stern. Victoria, you will apologize to Mrs. Waverly for overstepping your bounds and for discussing her private affairs around town. Marcus, you will apologize for misrepresenting her legal rights and for pressuring her to leave her own home. And Elena, you have some serious thinking to do about your priorities. But what about Penelope? Victoria asked plaintively. Penelope can live in one of the guest houses at Pinehurst Estate, Preston said firmly. Or we can convert the first floor of the carriage house for her use. What we cannot and will not do is displace Mrs. Waverly from her rightful home. Elena was crying openly now. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to go this far. Marcus said it would be better for everyone. And Victoria was so convincing about the benefits of senior living. And I thought, maybe... You thought maybe it would be easier to believe them than to think for yourself, I said quietly. Elena, I raised you to be stronger than this. I raised you to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I know, she whispered. I know you did. And I failed you. I failed Dad's memory, and I failed myself. Looking at my daughter's tear-streaked face, I felt my anger begin to soften slightly. Elena had been manipulated and pressured, just as I had been. The difference was that she had let herself be convinced that betraying her mother was somehow the right thing to do. We all make mistakes, Elena, I said. The question is what we do about them now. Sam Morrison had been right about bullies, backing down when faced with real opposition. Victoria was silent, Marcus looked defeated, and even Preston seemed eager to make amends. But the real test would be whether this moment of revelation would lead to lasting change, or whether they would simply regroup and find new ways to pressure me. I had my legal rights now, clearly established and understood by everyone in the eye. Room. But I also had something else, something that had been missing for months. I had my voice back, and I intended to use it. The confrontation in the living room had established my legal rights, but the real test of power came the following morning when I walked into the kitchen to find Victoria rearranging my cabinets. She had pulled everything out of the lower cupboards and was reorganizing according to what she called proper efficiency standards. My grandmother's china was stacked precariously on the counter, and my everyday dishes had been relocated to cabinets I couldn't reach without a stepladder. Victoria, I said calmly, though my pulse was racing. What exactly are you doing? She looked up from her organizational project with that familiar condescending smile. Oh, Margaret, I hope you... Don't mind. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd make myself useful. Your kitchen storage is terribly inefficient. I'm just making some improvements. The old Margaret would have stammered an apology and asked if there was anything I could do to help. The new Margaret, the one armed with legal knowledge, and Sam. Morrison's phone number had a different response. Put everything back exactly where you found it. Victoria blinked, clearly startled by my tone. I beg your pardon? You heard me. Put everything back. Now. Margaret, dear, I think you're overreacting. I'm simply trying to help make things more organized. Victoria, I interrupted, pulling out my phone. I'm going to count to 30. If my kitchen isn't restored to exactly the way it was when I went to bed last night, I'm calling Sam Morrison and filing a harassment complaint. Do you remember what Mr. Morrison said about the penalty clauses in my life estate? The color drained from Victoria's face. She did remember. If anyone attempted to interfere with my use and enjoyment of the property, they would forfeit all claims to ownership. Elena would lose the house entirely. You wouldn't, she said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. Try me, I replied, and started counting. 1, 2, 3. Victoria began putting dishes back into their original cabinets. By the time I reached 15, my kitchen was restored to its proper order. Victoria stood by the counter, her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This is far from over, Margaret." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "It's not over, it's just beginning. Because starting today, things are going to be very different around here." Marcus appeared in the doorway, dressed for work but moving cautiously, as if he expected the kitchen to explode. "Is everything all right?" I heard voices. "Everything is fine," I said pleasantly. "Your mother was just learning about boundaries. Weren't you, Victoria?" Victoria swept past Marcus without a word, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floors. A moment later, we heard the front door slam and her Mercedes roar to life in the driveway. Marcus looked at me warily. "Margaret, I think we need to discuss some ground rules for living together. This hostility isn't good for anyone." "I agree completely," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, at 6 a.m., because that was when I like to have my coffee. "Let's start with the ground rule that this is my house. I have a life estate here, which means I can use any room, any time, for any purpose I choose. I can have guests when I want them, eat when I want to eat, watch television when I want to. Watch it and do my laundry on whatever day suits me." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And what about our rights? Elena owns this house." "Elena owns the property," I corrected. "I own the right to live in it however I see fit. There's a difference, and you'd better learn it quickly." Elena emerged from the stairway, still in her pajamas, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Mom, please, can't we work something out? Some kind of compromise?" "I've been compromising for months, Elena. I've compromised myself into near invisibility. The compromising is over." I walked to the kitchen table and sat down with my coffee, gesturing for them to join me. "But I'm willing to establish some mutual agreements. Real agreements between equals, not the one-sided accommodations I've been making." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances before reluctantly taking seats across from me. This was the first time in months that we'd sat at this table as anything approaching equals, and they both seemed unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. "Here's what's going to happen," I began. "First, all of my belongings that have been moved to storage or relocated are coming back to their original places. My mother's china cabinet returns to the dining room. My books return to the living room shelves. My photographs return to the mantel. But the flow of the room," Marcus started, "is my concern, not yours," I finished. "Second, I will continue to use the master bedroom. If Penelope needs ground floor accommodations, your family can convert the sunroom or build an addition. That's not my problem to solve." Elena winced. "Mom, that's going to be expensive. Less expensive than losing the house entirely," I pointed out. "Which is what happens if anyone tries to force me out." Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to process this reversal of power. "And what about household decisions? Maintenance, utilities, renovations?" "Since Elena technically owns the property, she's responsible for those things," I said. "But any changes that affect my use and enjoyment of the house require my approval. You can't just decide to remodel the kitchen or redecorate the living room without my consent." "That seems restrictive," Marcus said carefully. "Not nearly as restrictive as what you've been trying to do to me," I replied. "The difference is that my restrictions are legally enforceable." Elena buried her face in her hands. "How did it come to this? How did we get to the point where we're negotiating like strangers instead of family?" The pain in her voice was genuine, and for a moment, I felt my resolve soften. But then I remembered the garbage bags, the assisted living brochures, the months of being made to feel like an unwelcome guest in my own home. "It came to this because you chose your husband's family over your own mother," I said quietly. "It came to this because you allowed Victoria to convince you that I was a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I never meant, Elena, intent doesn't matter when the impact is devastating. You meant to be kind when you..." Suggested I move to assisted living. You meant to be helpful when you reorganized my belongings. You meant to be practical when you agreed to give my bedroom to Marcus's grandmother. But the impact was that you systematically erased me from my own life. Marcus cleared his throat. So what happens now? Do we just coexist with this tension between us? That depends entirely on you, I said. I'm willing to be a gracious housemate if you're willing to be respectful ones, but the days of me making myself smaller to accommodate your preferences are over, permanently. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sam Morrison. How did the conversation go? Do we need to take any additional legal action? I showed the message to Elena and Marcus. Mr. Morrison is checking in to make sure yesterday's discussion was understood by everyone. Should I tell him that we've reached an understanding? Elena looked at Marcus, who was staring at the phone with obvious concern. The reality of having Richard's law partner monitoring the situation was clearly unsettling to him. Yes, Elena said quickly. Tell him we understand. Completely. I typed back, all clear for now. Family meeting was productive. We'll call if situation changes. Within seconds, Sam replied, Excellent. Remember, I'm always available if you need backup. I set the phone down and looked at my daughter and son-in-law. Here's what I suggest. We can try to rebuild our family relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. Or we can continue as legal adversaries sharing a house. The choice is yours. Elena reached across the table and took my hand. I want to rebuild, Mom. I want to be the daughter you raised me to be. And I want to be the son-in-law Richard would have been proud of, Marcus added, though his words sounded rehearsed. Then we start now, I said. And we start with honesty. No more behind-the-scenes discussions about my future. No more treating me like a problem to be solved. No more assuming you know what's best for me better than I do. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face again. I promise, Mom. I swear, on Dad's memory. It was a start. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, I felt like Margaret Waverley again, the woman who had raised a daughter, built a marriage, and created a home worth fighting for. And if anyone tried to take that away from me again, they would discover just how fierce a woman with legal backing could be. The days following our kitchen confrontation brought a tentative peace to Willowbrook Manor, but I could feel the undercurrents of resentment simmering beneath the surface. Victoria made herself scarce, appearing only for brief, tightly controlled visits during which she spoke to me with the kind of forced politeness usually reserved for disliked relatives at funerals. Marcus tried to be cordial, but his attempts at conversation felt stilted and artificial, as if he were following a script designed to avoid legal complications rather than expressing genuine warmth. Elena, however, seemed genuinely committed to repairing our relationship. She helped me restore my belongings to their rightful places, apologizing repeatedly as we returned my mother's china cabinet to the dining room and my family photographs to the mantel. But I could see the strain this was causing in her marriage. Marcus would disappear into his makeshift office whenever Elena and I were working together, and I often heard hushed, tense conversations coming from their bedroom late at night. The real test of our new arrangements came 2 weeks later when Preston Ashworth called to inform us that Penelope would be arriving the following month. The family had decided to convert the carriage house behind Pinehurst Estate into a suitable living space for her, but the renovations wouldn't be completed for several weeks. She would need temporary accommodations. Absolutely not, I said when Marcus approached me with the request. She cannot stay in the master bedroom. We've already established that. I understand that, Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. But we thought perhaps she could use one of the guest rooms upstairs just temporarily. And how exactly is a 90-year-old woman with mobility issues going to manage the stairs? Marcus was quiet for a moment, then suggested, we could install a temporary stair lift. I stared at him. You want to install mechanical equipment in my house without discussing it with me first? I thought we could discuss it now, he said carefully. It would be temporary, and we'd remove it once Penelope moves to the carriage house. It was a reasonable request, presented respectfully, without the manipulation and pressure tactics that had characterized our previous interactions. This was exactly the kind of conversation we should have been having all along. One adult asking another for accommodation, prepared to accept whatever answer was given. But I wasn't ready to be accommodating. Yet, the wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too recent. More importantly, I needed to establish once and for all that my consent could not be assumed or manipulated out of me. No, I said simply. Marcus blinked. No? No stair lift, no temporary accommodation for your grandmother. Your family created this problem by assuming they could take over my home. Your family can solve it without involving me. But Margaret, Marcus said, and I could hear his frustration breaking through his careful politeness. She's my grandmother. She's 90 years old. Are you really going to make an elderly woman suffer because you're angry with us? It was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation they'd been using all along, presenting my legitimate boundaries as cruelty to someone more vulnerable. But this time, I was ready for it. I'm not making anyone suffer, Marcus. I'm simply declining to solve a problem that isn't mine to solve. Your grandmother has a son who owns a mansion with multiple guest quarters. She has other grandchildren with homes. She has hotel options, extended stay facilities, any number of alternatives. What she doesn't have is a right to disrupt my home just because it's convenient for your family. You're being unreasonable, Marcus said, his careful composure finally cracking. After everything we've done to accommodate your wishes. Everything you've done, I interrupted. Marcus, you haven't accommodated anything. You've been forced to acknowledge my legal rights after months of trying to manipulate me out of them. That's not accommodation. That's compliance with the law. Elena appeared in the doorway, clearly having heard our raised voices. What's going on? Your mother is refusing to allow my grandmother to stay here temporarily, Marcus said, his tone suggesting that I was being unreasonably cruel. Elena looked back and forth between us, and I could see her struggling. Part of her wanted to support her husband's family obligations, but another part, the part that had seen what happened when she chose his family over mine, was hesitant to pressure me again. Mom, she said carefully, I know you're still angry about everything that happened, and you have every right to be, but this is different. This is about helping someone who really needs it. Elena, every request your husband's family has made has been presented as helping someone who really needs it. They needed space for Marcus's grandmother, so I needed to move to the basement. Victoria needed to organize my kitchen for efficiency, so my preferences didn't matter. Marcus needed quiet for his business calls, so I needed to wear headphones. At what point do my needs matter as much as theirs? Elena was quiet for a long moment. They matter, Mom. They absolutely matter. But maybe we could find some kind of compromise. We had a compromise, I said firmly. The compromise was that I signed over my house to you while retaining the right to live here peacefully. That was my compromise. Everything since then has been me giving up more and more while your husband's family takes more and more. So, what? Are you saying, Marcus asked, that you'll never help my family with anything? That you're going to hold this grudge forever? I looked at him carefully, trying to read his motivations. Was this genuine concern for his grandmother, or another attempt to establish precedent for overriding my decisions? I'm saying that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt slowly. And I'm saying that my cooperation is something to be earned, not demanded. What would it take? Elena asked quietly. What would it take for you to consider helping with Penelope? It was a fair question, and I realized I had an answer. An apology, a real one, from Victoria. Marcus laughed bitterly. You want my mother to apologize? I want your mother to acknowledge what she did. I want her to admit that she tried to manipulate my daughter into betraying me. I want her to apologize for discussing my private business around town and for making decisions about my life without my consent. And I want her to promise publicly that she will never again interfere in my living arrangements. She'll never do that, Marcus said. Then Penelope will have to make other arrangements, I replied. Elena looked stricken. Mom, you're putting me in an impossible position. If I support you, Marcus's family will never forgive me. If I support them, I'm betraying you again. No, Elena, I said gently. I'm not putting you in any position. I'm establishing my boundaries and standing by them. You get to choose how to respond to that, just like everyone else does. That evening, I received a phone call from Dorothy, my friend from the hospital. She'd heard through the Millbrook gossip network that there had been developments in my living situation. Margaret, honey, are you all right? Bev Patterson said she heard from her sister who works at Morrison's law office that you'd been in to see Sam about some kind of legal problem. Small towns. Nothing stayed private for long. I'm fine, Dorothy. Better than fine, actually. I've just been learning about some rights I'd forgotten I had. Good for you, Dorothy said firmly. I've been worried about you for months. You haven't seemed like yourself. I haven't been myself, I admitted. But I'm working on fixing that. Does this mean you'll be staying at Willowbrook Manor? For as long as I live, I said with more conviction than I'd felt about anything in months. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, with my photographs and my mother's furniture, and thought about the choice I'd made. I could have said yes to the stair lift, could have continued the pattern of endless accommodation that had nearly erased me from my own life. It would have been easier in the short term, would have avoided conflict and maintained family harmony. But family harmony built on one person's systematic diminishment wasn't really harmony at all. It was just the sound of someone slowly disappearing. I wasn't willing to disappear anymore. Not for Victoria's convenience, not for Marcus's grandmother's comfort, and not even for Elena's peace of mind. Tomorrow, I would find out whether the Ashworth family was willing to meet my terms, or whether they would choose to solve their problems without my help. Either way, I would still be Margaret Waverly, living in my own home, on my own terms. 3 days after I refused to accommodate Penelope, Victoria Ashworth arrived at my front door carrying a small wrapped gift and wearing an expression that looked like she'd been sucking on lemons. Elena had called ahead to warn me that Victoria was coming to discuss the situation, which I correctly interpreted as deliver the apology you demanded. I took my time answering the door, partly because I was finishing my morning coffee at my own pace, and partly because I wanted Victoria to wait long enough to really consider what she was about to do. When I finally opened the door, she was standing rigidly on the porch, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the October wind. "Margaret," she said through gritted teeth, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't agree to anything," I replied calmly. "You're standing on my porch uninvited, but you may come in." Victoria stepped into the foyer, her eyes automatically scanning the restored interior with obvious disapproval. My family photographs were back on the hall table. My mother's antique mirror hung in its original spot, and the warm, welcoming atmosphere she'd tried so hard to eliminate had been completely restored. "I brought you this," she said, extending the wrapped gift with all the enthusiasm of someone handing over a court-ordered fine. I accepted the package but didn't open it. "What can I do for you, Victoria?" She took a deep breath, and I could see her internal struggle playing out across her face. Every fiber of her being rebelled against what she was about to do, but the alternative, finding another solution for Penelope, was apparently unacceptable to the Ashworth family. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, the words sounding like they physically hurt to speak. "For what, specifically?" Victoria's jaw clenched. She'd clearly hoped to get through this with a general, meaningless apology that acknowledged no particular wrongdoing. But I'd been manipulated by experts for months, and I wasn't accepting anything less than complete honesty. For overstepping my bounds, she said carefully. For making assumptions about your living arrangements. And for discussing your private affairs without your permission. With whom did you discuss my private affairs, Victoria? Another internal battle. With the director at Sunset Meadows, and Dr. Patterson, and the property management company for several assisted living facilities. And what did you tell them? I told them that you might benefit from a more structured living environment. The admission came out in a rush, as if saying it quickly would make it less damaging. Because I thought you were having difficulty managing on your own? Based on what evidence? Victoria's composure was beginning to crack. I don't understand what you want me to say, Margaret. I want you to tell the truth. You didn't think I was having difficulty managing. You thought I was inconvenient. You wanted me gone so your family could take over my house completely. Isn't that right? For a moment I thought she might walk out rather than admit the truth. But the need to secure temporary housing for Penelope apparently outweighed her pride. Yes, she said quietly. I thought it would be better for everyone if you moved to a senior community. Better for everyone, or better for your family? Better for my family, she conceded. And you enlisted my daughter in this effort to remove me from my own home. Yes. And you put me on waiting lists for assisted living. Facilities without my knowledge or consent? Yes. And you attempted to convince my daughter that I was becoming a burden who needed to be managed rather than a person who deserved respect. Victoria's face was flushed now, her perfect composure completely shattered. Yes. I did all of those things, and I apologize. It wasn't gracious, and it certainly wasn't heartfelt, but it was honest. More honest than I'd expected Victoria Ashworth was capable of being. Thank you, I said simply. Was there anything else? Penelope? Victoria said quickly, sensing an opening. Now that we've cleared the air, perhaps we could discuss— No. Victoria blinked. No? Your apology, while appreciated, doesn't automatically entitle your family to my cooperation. Trust isn't rebuilt with a single conversation, Victoria. It's rebuilt through consistent, respectful behavior over time. But Penelope needs somewhere to stay. Then your family will find somewhere for her to stay. Somewhere that doesn't involve disrupting my home or my peace of mind. Margaret, please be reasonable. I am being perfectly reasonable. I'm simply not being accommodating. There's a difference. Victoria left 20 minutes later, her mission only partially accomplished. She'd delivered the apology I'd demanded, but she hadn't secured the cooperation she'd hoped for. As I watched her Mercedes disappear down Maple Ridge Drive, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete satisfaction with a boundary I'd set and maintained. The wrapped gift she'd brought turned out to be an expensive candle with a note that read, "With hopes for better understanding." I set both the candle and the note aside, unimpressed by the gesture. Victoria Ashworth's idea of making amends was to buy something expensive and hope it would purchase forgiveness. The real test came that evening when Elena and Marcus returned from work. Elena looked hopeful when she saw me, clearly expecting that Victoria's visit had resolved everything. Marcus looked resigned, as if he'd already accepted that his grandmother would need to make other arrangements. How did it go with Victoria? Elena asked, settling into the chair across from me in the living room. She apologized, as requested. And? Marcus prompted. And nothing. She apologized for her behavior. That doesn't change my decision about the temporary accommodations. Elena's face fell. Mom, I thought if she apologized. You thought an apology would automatically get you what you wanted, I interrupted. But apologies don't work that way, Elena. They acknowledge wrongdoing. They don't erase consequences. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now you find another solution for your grandmother. There are dozens of alternatives that don't involve my home. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then surprised me by nodding. You're right. We should have explored other options from the beginning instead of assuming you'd accommodate whatever we needed. It was the first genuinely respectful thing he'd said, to me in months, and I felt some of my defensiveness ease slightly. Thank you for acknowledging that, I said. Preston found a furnished apartment downtown that Penelope can use temporarily, Elena said. It's only a few blocks from Pinehurst Estate, so we can check on her easily. That sounds like an excellent solution. It is, Marcus agreed. And Margaret, I want you to know that I understand why you said no. You needed to know that your boundaries would be respected, not just bypassed whenever we wanted something. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or resentment. Instead, I saw something that looked like genuine understanding. Perhaps the shock of nearly losing the house entirely had taught him something about the difference between ownership and dominance. I appreciate that, Marcus. Elena leaned forward in her chair. Mom, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Do you think we can rebuild our relationship? Do you think we can be a real family again? It was a fair question, and I considered it carefully before answering. I think we can build a different kind of relationship, I said finally. One based on mutual respect instead of one-sided accommodation. But it's going to take time, and it's going to require all of us to change how we interact with each other. What kind of changes? Elena asked. For starters, no more family decisions made behind closed doors that affect my life. No more assumptions about what I want or need. No more treating me like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be consulted. And in return? Marcus asked. In return, I'll be a gracious housemate. I'll participate in family activities when invited. I'll help when asked respectfully and when the help genuinely benefits everyone, not just your family's convenience. Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. That sounds like the kind of family I want to be part of. Then that's what we'll work toward, I said. As they headed upstairs that night, I remained in the living room, surrounded by my restored belongings and my reclaimed sense of self. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt like I had a real future. Not just surviving day by day, but actually living with purpose and dignity. The woman who had been disappearing piece by piece over the past months was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer about her worth, and absolutely certain of her right to take up space in her own life. It felt like coming home to myself. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind Willowbrook Manor, watching Elena teach her 3-year-old nephew Timothy how to plant marigolds in the same flower bed where I'd once taught her the same lesson. The sight filled me with a contentment I hadn't felt in years, not the desperate clinging to past happiness that had characterized my early widowhood, but the deep satisfaction of seeing family traditions continue and evolve naturally. The changes in our household had been gradual but profound. Elena had kept her promise about rebuilding our relationship, but more importantly, she'd rediscovered the strength and independence I'd raised her to have. When Victoria suggested that Easter dinner should be held at Pinehurst Estate, for everyone's convenience, Elena politely declined and announced that we'd be hosting at Willowbrook Manor as we always had. When Marcus's business partner made disparaging comments about elderly family members who don't know when to step aside, Elena firmly corrected him and made it clear that disrespecting her mother was not acceptable. Marcus himself had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The entitled, dismissive man who had once treated me like an unwelcome guest had gradually been replaced by someone who actually seemed to value my presence in the family. He asked for my advice on household decisions, remembered my preferences when planning family events, and most surprisingly, had begun seeking my counsel on business matters. It turned out that 30 years of managing a household budget and dealing with difficult people at the hospital had given me skills that translated well to his investment firm challenges. "Margaret," he'd said just last week, "I wanted to run something by you. We're thinking about expanding into retirement planning services, and I'd love to get your perspective on what people our clients' age really need. Our clients' age, not your age or elderly clients, but a designation that included him as someone who would someday face the same concerns." It was a small linguistic shift that represented a huge change in how he saw me, not as a burden from a previous generation, but as someone with valuable experience and insights. Even Victoria had eventually adapted to the new reality, though her transformation had been more grudging than genuine. She no longer made unilateral decisions about my belongings or my living arrangements, but I suspected this was more about legal self-preservation than actual respect. Still, she'd learned to be civil, and civility was enough. Not every relationship needed to be warm to be functional. The real surprise had been Penelope Ashworth, Marcus's grandmother, who had become an unexpected ally and friend. When the carriage house renovations were finally completed, she'd moved into her new quarters, but continued to visit Willowbrook Manor regularly. At 92, she was sharp, witty, and refreshingly honest about her family's shortcomings. "Victoria has always been a steamroller," she'd confided during one of our afternoon tea sessions on the front porch. "She means well, but she thinks efficiency is more important than feelings." It took her 50 years to realize that people aren't business problems to be solved. Penelope had also shared stories about her own struggles with family dynamics after her husband's death. "They wanted to manage me, too," she'd said. "Put me in a nice facility where I'd be safe and cared for. I had to threaten to write them out of my will before they accepted that I was still capable of making my own decisions." These conversations had helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique. Many women of our generation had faced similar challenges when families confused care with control, when adult children mistook accommodation for love. The legal protection Sam Morrison had built into my deed transfer had been crucial, but it wasn't the only thing that had saved me. What had really made the difference was my willingness to use that protection, to stop accommodating my way into invisibility and start insisting on my right to exist fully in my own life. Dorothy had noticed the change immediately. "You're different," she'd said during one of our Thursday lunches. "You're more yourself than you've been since Richard died." She was right. For the first time since my husband's passing, I felt like a complete person rather than half of a broken pear. I'd rediscovered interests and friendships that had been neglected during my months of family accommodation. I'd started volunteering at the Millbrook Community Center, teaching literacy classes to adult learners. I'd joined a book club, taken up watercolor painting, and even started dating, something I'd never imagined doing again. James Patterson was a retired history professor who'd moved to Millbrook after his wife's death 3 years earlier. We'd met at the community center, bonded over our shared love of historical fiction, and gradually developed a friendship that had slowly become something more. He was kind, intelligent, and most importantly, he saw me as Margaret Waverley. Not as Richard's widow, not as Elena's mother, not as someone's responsibility to manage, but as a woman with her own thoughts, dreams, and desires. "You know what I love about you," he'd said just last week as we walked through Riverside Park after dinner at the new Italian restaurant downtown. "You're completely yourself. No pretense, no need to be anything other than who you are." It had been the most romantic thing anyone had said to me in years. Elena had been initially uncertain about my relationship with James, not because she disapproved, but because she was still learning to see me as a complete person rather than just her mother. But when she saw how happy he made me, how much I laughed when he was around, she'd embraced him warmly into our extended family. "I like seeing you like this," she'd told me after James had joined us for Sunday dinner. "You're glowing. It reminds me of how you used to be when I was little before Dad got sick." The house itself had become a source of joy again rather than a battleground. Elena and Marcus had made thoughtful improvements that enhanced rather than erased its character. They'd restored the original hardwood floors, updated the kitchen while keeping its warm, welcoming feel, and converted Richard's old study into a bright reading room where I spent many peaceful mornings with my books and coffee. Most importantly, they'd learned to see Willowbrook Manor as our shared home, rather than their property with an inconvenient occupant. Family decisions were made collectively, household responsibilities were divided fairly, and everyone's needs were considered equally. Standing in the garden on this perfect spring afternoon, watching Timothy's serious concentration as Elena showed him how to pat soil around the tiny marigold seedlings, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. The betrayal and manipulation I'd endured had been painful, but they'd also been necessary. Without being pushed to my breaking point, I might never have rediscovered my own strength. "Grandma Margaret," Timothy called out, using the title he'd invented to distinguish me from Grandma Penelope. "Look, I planted this one all by myself." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I replied, admiring his slightly crooked but enthusiastic planting technique. "Your daddy used to help me plant flowers in this same spot when she was about your age." "Really? Mommy was little like me?" "Smaller than you," Elena laughed, "and much messier. I used to get more dirt on myself than in the holes." As the afternoon light began to fade, we gathered our gardening tools and headed inside for dinner. James would be joining us, along with Marcus and Penelope. The dining room table would be full of family, not just the family I'd been born into or married into, but the family I'd chosen and fought for and helped to rebuild on terms of mutual respect and genuine love. Richard would have been proud. I thought, not just of the family we'd preserved, but of the woman I'd become in the process of preserving it. The woman who'd almost disappeared in a desperate attempt to keep everyone happy had been replaced by someone who understood that real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller. As I looked around the dinner table that evening, listening to the comfortable chaos of family conversation, I realized that this was what home really meant. Not just a physical structure, not just a collection of memories, but a place where everyone could be fully themselves without fear of judgment or manipulation. It had taken me 68 years to learn that lesson, but as my grandmother used to say, "The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today." I'd planted mine just in time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.